It started with a letter. A crisp white envelope. An official HOA letterhead. The kind of thing that shows up in your mailbox and immediately ruins your morning, because you know, before you even open it, that some petty tyrant with too much time on their hands has found something to complain about, but this letter was different. This letter went beyond petty. The HOA of a quiet suburban neighborhood, we'll call it Oakwood, sent out a directive to all residents with children. And the directive said, in no uncertain terms, no parents are to wait with their children at the neighborhood bus stop. Not parked in their cars. Not standing on the sidewalk. Not anywhere near the designated pickup area. Parents were to drop their kids off and leave. Go home. Go to work. Go anywhere else. But do not stay. The reason? Neighbors had complained. They said it was uncomfortable having people outside their homes. They said parents were blocking mailboxes. They said, and this is the phrase that really got people's attention, that parents waiting with their children constituted loitering. Loitering. You know, like criminals do. Like people with no legitimate business in a place. Like people who are, what, exactly? Watching their 6-year-old get on a school bus. The letter concluded with what the HOA board clearly thought was a reassuring note. A phrase they would come to deeply, deeply regret. Our neighborhood is safe, the letter said. You should feel safe leaving your children at the bus stop unattended. The letter was signed by the HOA board, including their president, and that's where the story takes a very, very dark turn. I sat back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a long moment. This wasn't a small technicality, this was potentially decades of an HOA collecting fines and issuing permits under an authority that legally didn't exist for lakefront water use. But I knew better than to walk into the next meeting waving a piece of paper and declaring victory. HOAs don't back down just because they're wrong. I needed this locked down by a real estate attorney before I said another word to Diane Whitfield. I hired Patricia Nguyen, a property rights attorney 2 towns over who specialized in exactly this kind of dispute, HOA overreach on riparian rights. She reviewed the chain of title, the 1961 land grant documents, and my deed for almost 2 weeks before calling me back. Daniel, she said, this isn't just a strong case. This is about as clean a water rights claim as I've seen. The HOA has no legal standing to fine you for using water attached to your own deeded riparian rights. And depending on how many fines they've issued to other lakefront owners over the years, this could be a lot bigger than just your case. Mike kept digging that he was the kind of person who couldn't let things go, especially when those things involved the safety of children. And the more he dug, the more he found that he discovered who the HOA president was. We'll call him President Thompson. And then Mike discovered what President Thompson had done, or rather, what he had allegedly done. 27 times in the 1990s, Thompson had been accused of 27 different sexual crimes against minors. 27. 3 of the alleged victims were members of his own family. He was fired from his position, whatever that position was, the records don't specify, due to these allegations. But here's the thing that made Mike's blood run cold. Thompson never served a single day in prison. The allegations were there. The firing was there. But somehow, through whatever cracks existed in the justice system at the time, Thompson walked away. He moved. He started over. He bought a house in Oakwood. And eventually, because the world has a very dark sense of humor, he worked his way onto the HOA board. Then became its president, and now, as HOA president, this man, a man with 27 allegations of sexual crimes against children in his past, was sending letters to parents telling them to leave their kids at the bus stop. Alone. Unattended. Because our neighborhood is safe. Mike sat at his kitchen table. He looked at the letter. He looked at his research. He looked out the window at the bus stop where his own children waited every morning. Then he made a decision that he was going to expose this publicly. And he was going to make sure every single parent in Oakwood knew exactly who was telling them to abandon their children at a bus stop. Mike didn't go to the HOA board first. He didn't file a formal complaint. He didn't request a meeting, that he went straight to the neighborhood.in, a single post, on whichever neighborhood platform they used, Nextdoor or Facebook or whatever digital town square Oakwood gathered in. Mike laid out everything. Item 1, the bus stop was outside his house. He hadn't complained. He welcomed parents waiting with their kids. The HOA had manufactured this concern out of thin air. Item 2, across the street from the bus stop, there had been an armed standoff. The suspect was still living there. On house arrest. Within visual distance of the place the HOA wanted children to stand alone. Item 3, 3 registered sex offenders lived within the neighborhood. 3. And Item 4, the bombshell, the HOA president himself, the very man who had signed the Safe Neighborhood letter, had been fired for 27 allegations of sexual crimes against minors. 3 of the alleged victims were his own family members. Mike attached his sources. He cited his research. He made it clear that every single thing he was saying was verifiable public record. Then he added one final touch, an invitation. If the HOA pushes this issue, he wrote, all parents are invited to my house during drop-off and pick-up times. As guests of the landowner, the HOA has no jurisdiction over who stands on my property. Checkmate. The post went up. And Oakwood exploded. Comments poured in. Parents who had received the letter, parents who had felt vaguely uncomfortable about it but couldn't quite articulate why, suddenly understood exactly what was happening. Mothers who had been planning to comply were now furious. Fathers who had shrugged off the letter as typical HOA nonsense, were now reading Mike's post and going pale. The post spread. Within hours, everyone in Oakwood knew, and someone who really wished they didn't know, was the HOA board. The HOA's response was not what you would call strategic. Instead of addressing the substance of Mike's post, instead of explaining why children's safety wasn't a concern, or why parents shouldn't be worried about the registered sex offenders or the armed standoff or the president's 27 allegations, they did the one thing guaranteed to make the situation worse: they sent Mike an email. Please take the post down. That was it. No explanation. No engagement with the facts. No acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, telling parents to leave their kids alone with a sex offender president and 3 registered predators nearby wasn't a great look. Just, please take the post down. Mike, being Mike, did not take the post down. In fact, he did something much more interesting: that he took a screenshot of the HOA's email and added it to the post. Updated in real time. For everyone to see. Look, the update essentially said. They don't want to explain themselves. They don't want to address any of the facts. They just want the post gone. They want this silenced. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Parents who had been on the fence were now firmly on Mike's side. The HOA's attempt at censorship backfired so completely that it felt like a scene from a movie, the kind of scene where the villain, cornered, makes a move so stupid that the audience almost feels sorry for them. Almost. The post stayed up. The parents kept showing up at the bus stop. And the HOA board sat in their next meeting, looking at an inbox full of furious emails, wondering how a simple letter about bus stop etiquette had turned into the biggest crisis in Oakwood's history. A few days later, every resident of Oakwood received a second letter. This one was very different from the first. Where the first letter had been commanding, this one was defensive. Where the first letter had been certain, this one was backtracking so fast it was practically running in reverse. Dear residents, it began. We are writing to clarify a recent communication regarding street parking and bus stop etiquette. Clarify. Interesting word choice. When a government agency or corporate PR department uses the word clarify, what they really mean is, we said something terrible and now we're trying to pretend we didn't mean it. And that is exactly what the HOA tried to do. The letter continued. Our previous letter was intended as a friendly suggestion and not a formal ruling or directive. A friendly suggestion. This was the same board that had used the phrase, no parents are to wait at the bus stop. That was not friendly. That was not a suggestion. That was an order. And everyone in Oakwood knew it, but the HOA wasn't done rewriting history. The purpose of our initial letter was to remind everyone to keep driveways clear and to maintain a socially acceptable distance from the bus stop. Socially acceptable distance. From a bus stop. Where children wait. For a bus. We sincerely apologize, the letter concluded, if our previous message caused any confusion or concern. It was never our intention to imply that children should be left unattended at the bus stop. Never their intention, except that the original letter had literally said, in writing, you should feel safe leaving your children at the bus stop unattended. That was a direct quote. It was right there. Every parent in Oakwood still had the original letter. They could compare the two. And they did. There was something off about this second letter. Something that Mike and several other neighbors noticed immediately. The language was weird. Maintain a socially acceptable distance from the bus stop. Ample space without feeling crowded. Safe and welcoming community for all. These are not phrases that human beings use naturally. These are the kind of phrases that come out of an AI language model when you type, "Write me a professional apology letter for an HOA that told parents not to wait with their kids at a bus stop." Mike and his neighbors had a debate about it in the comments. Was the letter written by AI? Some thought yes. Some thought no, maybe it was a lawyer, they said. Maybe it was a PR consultant, but the consensus was clear, whether AI or human, this was a coward's letter. It took no responsibility. It offered no real accountability. It tried to gaslight an entire neighborhood into believing that the original letter, the one everyone still had just been misunderstood. And here's the thing about gaslighting, it only works when people don't have receipts. Oakwood had receipts, they had the original letter. They had Mike's post. They had the screenshot of the HOA's desperate, "Please take it down" email. They had the public records about the HOA president's past. They had the sex offender registry. They had the news articles about the armed standoff. You cannot gaslight people who are holding the evidence in their hands. Here's what the HOA failed to understand: when you attack something as fundamental as a parent's right to protect their child, you don't just anger one person. You don't even anger one family. You wake up an entire community. After Mike's post, something shifted in Oakwood. Parents who had never spoken to each other before, people who had lived 3 houses apart for 5 years without exchanging more than a wave, suddenly had something in common. They had a common enemy. And nothing unites people faster than a common enemy who's trying to endanger their children. The morning drop-off became a social event. More parents started showing up, not fewer. People brought coffee. They chatted. They watched the kids board the bus together. And then they'd wave goodbye and go about their day, but the message was unmistakable: you cannot tell us to abandon our children. Mike had offered his house as a gathering point, and parents took him up on it. Technically, they were guests on his property. Technically, the HOA had no authority over who stood on Mike's sidewalk. And technically, every parent at that bus stop was now a guest of the homeowner. Loophole closed. The bus stop became Oakwood's little patch of resistance. And the HOA, which had expected compliance, which had expected people to just follow the rules like they always did, was completely powerless to stop it.